Hello, friends. Welcome to Angareji Sahitya. Today, we are diving into the peaceful, poetic world of William Wordsworth, the man who taught us to see nature not just with our eyes, but with our hearts. William Wordsworth is remembered as one of the greatest English poets of all time, often called the father of Romantic poetry. He completely changed the way people thought about poems. At a time when poetry was all about fancy language and heroic tales, Wordsworth came along and said, "Let's talk about nature, feelings, and childhood." He believed poetry should come from the heart and connect with ordinary people. Now, let's discuss the early life of William Wordsworth. He was born on April 7, 1770, in the small town of Cockermouth in England's beautiful Lake District. Surrounded by hills, rivers, and open skies, nature became his first and greatest teacher. But his childhood wasn't easy. He lost his mother when he was just 8 years old, and his father passed away when he was 13. These early losses left a deep emotional mark on him, one that would later echo in his poetry. He went to school in Hawkshead, where he fell in love with books and began writing his own verses. Later, at Cambridge University, he studied hard but often felt disconnected from city life. All along, his heart stayed in the countryside. The peace, power, and mystery of nature would shape not only his imagination, but his entire poetic identity. Friends, in 1789, when William Wordsworth was just 19 years old, he set off on a journey that would change his life. He went to France, right in the middle of the French Revolution. At first, he was filled with hope and excitement. The revolution wasn't just politics, it felt like the dawn of a new world. Wordsworth believed deeply in the ideas of freedom, equality, and the rights of ordinary people. He walked the streets of Paris, listened to revolutionary speeches, and felt inspired by the belief that real change was possible. While in France, he met Annette Vallon, a young French woman. They fell in love, and in 1792, Annette gave birth to their daughter Caroline. But happiness doesn't last long. War broke out between England and France, and Wordsworth had to return home. Because of political tensions and money troubles, he couldn't return to France or support Annette and his child the way he wanted. The separation haunted him for the rest of his life. As the revolution grew more violent, Wordsworth became disillusioned. The ideals he had once believed in were now soaked in blood and chaos. The reign of terror, with public executions and political fear, crushed the hope he had felt in the early days. These emotional and moral crises deeply affected him. Friends, he questioned not just politics, but the very nature of humanity. Friends, these years shaped him in profound ways. They taught him that great ideas can be dangerous when they lose touch with compassion. He turned inward, reflecting more on the individual soul, on suffering, and on healing through nature. His poetry would soon become a response, not just to the world's violence, but to the deep need for peace, understanding, and emotional truth. Friends, after the heartbreak of France and the confusion of the political ideals, William Wordsworth returned to England, searching for clarity and purpose. That's when something life changing happened. He met Samuel Taylor Coleridge in 1795. The two instantly connected. Coleridge was brilliant, eccentric, and full of ideas. Wordsworth was thoughtful, steady, and deeply reflective. Together, they formed one of the most powerful literary friendships in English history. In 1797, Wordsworth, his sister Dorothy, and Coleridge moved to Somerset, where they lived and worked closely together. They spent hours walking, talking, and writing, often inspired by the countryside around them. Dorothy kept journals that described the natural world in vivid detail. Her notes would become the seed for some of Wordsworth's most famous poems. In 1798, the two friends published a small book of poems that would change English literature forever, and that is Lyrical Ballads. It wasn't just a collection of poems, it was a revolution in poetry itself. Until then, poetry was often full of complex language, novel themes, and classical references. But Lyrical Ballads was different. It focused on common people, ordinary experiences, and simple language. It was a poetry of emotion and everyday life. Wordsworth's contribution included poems like Lines Written a Few Miles Above Tinton Abbey, where he reflects on memory, nature, and the healing power of beauty. Coleridge's most famous contribution was The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a haunting tale of guilt, nature, and redemption. Together, they wrote a powerful introduction to the book, declaring that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, recollected in tranquility. That line became the heart of Romanticism. Friends, this period was incredibly productive for Wordsworth. He wasn't just writing, he was reshaping the meaning and purpose of poetry. He believed poetry should come from within, not be dressed up in fancy words. It should be about real emotions, real people, and our deep connection with nature and memory. Friends, now let's discuss major works and philosophy of William Wordsworth. Friends, after years of restlessness, emotional pain, and creative discovery, William Wordsworth finally found a sense of peace in the quiet village of Grasmere. Nestled in the Lake District, the very landscape that had shaped his imagination since childhood, he moved into a cozy cottage called Dove Cottage in 1799, and in 1802 he married his childhood friend Mary Hutchinson, living with Mary, his beloved sister Dorothy, and later his children. Wordsworth began the most productive and profound phase of his poetic life. This was the first time when nature truly became the heart of his poetry. For Wordsworth, nature wasn't just beautiful scenery, it was a living force, a kind of spiritual guide that could comfort, heal, and even teach. He believed that in the modern world, people were becoming too obsessed with money, power, and machines, and they were losing their connection to the natural world and to themselves. Friends, one of his most famous poems from this period is I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. Inspired by a walk with Dorothy, when they saw a long stretch of golden daffodils dancing in the wind, the poem captures how a simple moment in nature can stay with us and bring joy. Even long after the experience has passed, it's not just a nature poem. It's a poem about memory, imagination, and inner peace. Friends, Wordsworth also wrote the moving and mysterious Lucy poems about a girl who lives close to nature and seems to be part of it. These poems explore love, loneliness, and loss, using nature as a backdrop to express deep emotions. Another major poem, Ode, Imitation of Immortality, is one of his most spiritual works. In it, Wordsworth talks about how children see the world with wonder and purity, as if they have just come from heaven. As we grow up, he says, we lost that clear vision, but nature can help us remember who we really are. Friends, during this time, Wordsworth poetry was full of peaceful walks, quiet lakes, rustling trees, and emotional reflection. But it wasn't just about landscapes. It was about the soul's relationships with world around it. He believed that by observing nature and reflecting on our experiences, we could become wiser, more compassionate human beings. Friends, he also believed that poetry should speak in the language of ordinary people, not in complicated or grand words. His goal was to make poetry a mirror for life, not just for scholars, but for everyone. In these years, William Wordsworth became the true poet of nature, not just describing it, but showing how it could guide the human heart. His poems help readers reconnect with stillness, simplicity, and beauty of everyday life, offering a kind of spiritual truth in an increasingly noisy world. Friends, while living in the quiet beauty of the Lake District, William Wordsworth spent years working on a poem that was, in many ways, the story of his soul. This poem was called The Prelude, and it would become his masterpiece, even though it wasn't published until after his death. The Prelude is not just a short poem, it's a long, book length reflection on his own life. thoughts, and growth as a poet. But it's not just a personal story. It's a journey through memory, nature, childhood, revolution, heartbreak, and the search for meaning. Wordsworth wasn't writing to impress. He was writing to understand himself and in doing so, help others reflect on their own lives. The poem starts in his early childhood, describing how deeply connected he felt to nature as a boy. He talks about chasing through forest, rowing on lakes, and even being frightened by the power of the mountains and storms. But instead of running from that fear, he felt that nature was shaping his spirit, disciplining his imagination, and teaching him awe. As he grows, the prelude moves into his youth and college years. His time in France during the Revolution and his return home with a mind full of turmoil. He struggles with big questions. What is the role of a poet? What should one do when faced with political failures or personal loss? How can beauty heal the wounds of experience? Friends, throughout the poem, nature remains his guide, not just as scenery, but as a spiritual presence. He often suggests that natural world holds wisdom that humans have forgotten. He believed poetry was not just art, it was a way to restore that lost connection. Friends, the prelude is remarkable because it doesn't tell a dramatic, action filled story. Instead, it dives into the inner life, his fears, joys, questions, and discoveries. It shows how the poet grows not through events, but through reflection and emotional experience. That's what made it so modern, even ahead of its time. Friends, though Wordsworth never published the prelude in his lifetime, he kept revising it again and again. It eventually came out after his death in 1850. Today, it's considered one of the greatest autobiographical poems in the English language and one of the clearest windows into the soul of a poet. In the prelude, Wordsworth gave the world something rare, an honest spiritual map of a man's heart and mind, shaped by nature, experience, and the power of thought. Friends, now let's discuss personal life and loss of William Wordsworth. During this period, Wordsworth faced deep personal sorrow. In 1802, he married his childhood friend Mary Hutchinson, and they had a happy family life for a time. But tragedy struck when two of their children died young, and around the same time, his brother John was lost in shipwreck. These heartbreaking losses left lasting emotional scars. Through it all, remained close to his beloved sister Dorothy, whose companionship and nature journals continued to inspire his poetry. But even Dorothy's health began to decline in the later years. These experiences of grief and emotional weight entered his poetry, not always directly, but through a more serious, reflective tone. His poems became more meditative, exploring the fragility of life and the quiet strength found in memory, nature, and the family bonds. Friends, as Wordsworth grew older, his views began to shift. The once radical young poet who had supported revolution and change slowly became more conservative. He began to favor order, tradition, and religion over political activism. Many of his early supporters were surprised, even disappointed, by this change. But for Wordsworth, it was a natural progression. After experiencing personal loss and watching the chaos of the world, he found comfort in the stability and faith. In 1843, Wordsworth was appointed Poet Laureate of England, the country's highest honor for a poet. He was already respected and admired for his time, seen as the wise, moral voice in English literature. Interestingly, he barely wrote any official poems in this role. His earlier works had already spoken so deeply to the soul of the nation. In his final years, Wordsworth wrote less poetry and spent more time in quiet reflection. Though his political fire had cooled, his deep love for nature and humanity remained at the core of who he was. Friends, William Wordsworth passed away on April 23, 1850, at the age of 80. That same year, his greatest works, The Prelude, was finally published, giving the world a full view of his poetic journey. By then, Wordsworth had already changed English literature forever. He helped lead the Romantic movement, which shifted poetry away from aristocratic themes and towards the lives, emotions, and inner world of ordinary people. Not He made nature not just a backdrop, but a living presence in poetry. His belief that simple language could express deep truth opened the door for generations of poets after him. Writers like Keats, Shelley, and Byron were inspired by his approach, and even modern poets today echo his themes of nature, memory, and childhood, and the search for meaning. Beyond literature, Wordsworth's work also influenced early ideas of environmentalism, encouraging people to reconnect with the natural world. His poems remind us that even in a noisy, fast moving world, there is wisdom in the quiet hills, peace in the trees, and healing in the rivers. Friends, William Wordsworth's voice still echoes through the pages of English literature, not with shouts, but with whispers of truth. In a world driven by noise, speed, and distraction, his poetry gently invites us to slow down, breathe deeply, and notice the beauty around us. Friends, a child's laughter, a field of daffodils, a quiet walk in the woods. These simple things for Wordsworth held the key to deeper understanding and inner peace. Thank you for watching this journey through the life and legacy of William Wordsworth. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Angareji Sahitya, where timeless literature comes alive.